Our program tonight, How Gerrymandering and Rules Block Good Government and How We Can Fix It, presented by Terry Scattini, is co-sponsored by the Adult Education Committee and the Brit Olam Steering Committee of Congregation Knesset Israel in Allentown. And for the non-members in the audience, we call ourselves the members of KI. We say KI rather than Knesset Israel, which is somewhat of a mouthful. But our Brit Olam, our steering committee, Brit Olam in Hebrew means covenant with the world. We envision KI as a place where we live out our commitment to work toward a just society, a place of learning what it really means to live the values of Judaism in our modern world, a place of compassion and growth for members and friends seeking to understand their obligations to each other and to the world, and a place where we act in accord with our understanding. Our Jewish tradition has much to say about democracy. The sage Hillel taught, do not separate yourself from the community. It is our responsibility to play an active role in our community, including choosing its leaders. Rabbinic tradition includes the following edict. A ruler is not to be appointed unless the community is first consulted. This principle traces back to the Torah story of the building of the sacred tabernacle, in which community approval was necessary to decide who would lead the project. This deeply embedded ethic of political participation has guided Jews to enthusiastically participate in the American electoral process. Of course, for any of us to take part in the political process, we have to be informed, and that's what brings us here tonight. So thank you again for coming this evening. I've invited KI congregant Janie Cohen to introduce our speaker. Janie is committed to the principles of fair districting, and it was she who recommended that we offer tonight's program. Thank you, Janie, for your suggestion, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. I'm very pleased to welcome Terry and to introduce him. He is a volunteer for Fair Districts. He is an educator and scientist focused on facilitating collaboration among nonprofit, public, and for-profit organizations for the better of our communities. Years ago, Terry concluded that gerrymandering hindered legislators in their ability to work together to solve common problems. He believes that fair districts will revive civil discourse and productive engagement between voters and our legislators. And the best thing about it is he's a member of KI. So welcome, Terry, and thank you very much for having a passion for fair districts.
Thank you so much, Janie. I'm going to switch over to the slides right now, but along the way, just want to thank Janie, Marianne, all of the volunteers and staff at KI, the Brit Olam Steering Committee, for hosting this site. So we'll switch over to the share screen, and just if someone could let me know if that first slide is showing up when I click on this. Okay, thank you so much. And you can hear me okay? All right, thank you. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about how gerrymandering and the rules that govern the chambers block good government and how we can fix it. Wanted to let you know that this is a presentation that I do as a volunteer for Fair Districts PA. Fair Districts PA is a project of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. If you go to fairdistrictspa.com, you can find a lot of good information. I've been a member of the League for about 30 years, but I started getting very active when Fair Districts started getting publicized in 2016, 2017. As Janie's introduction mentioned, I've thought about gerrymandering for decades because it's not happening just here in Pennsylvania. So, with that, just want to by way of introduction. So I'm going to present a lot of information. It may seem dense at times. I hope that I'm going to do it in a way that's educational. For those of you that are on the email list, I believe you got a PDF of it, or we can send it to you so you can look at it afterwards. But just know that there's lots of places to get the information, to look this over, to go to the websites, to contact me. I'm happy to follow up with folks. So that being said, this first slide, I want to emphasize to you what I hope that you will walk away from this meeting. And that is, as you see on your screen, gerrymandering may not be the issue that you care about most. It is just the issue that you need to care about first. So again, I hope that by the time this presentation is over, regardless of what is your issue of passion that you know needs to get resolved, you will see that we need to fix this issue about gerrymandering, and related to that, the rules of how our legislature runs, in order to get to your issue. So that being said, let me get into what we're talking about. The agenda is I'm going to give you a brief introduction tonight about gerrymandering, what it is, why it's a problem. And I'm going to talk about the 4 types of gerrymandering: congressional for the US House of Representatives, the state legislative, prison gerrymandering, which I just learned about recently, and judicial gerrymandering. It's not here yet, but they sure are trying to do it. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how the rules block reform and consequently good government. And most importantly, how you could help fix it all. So let's start with how this all kind of is grounded in the US Constitution. We all know that the census is conducted every 10 years as prescribed in the US Constitution. And one of the things that happens after the census population figures are released is that congressional seats are reassigned amongst the states. They're reallocated. For over 100 years, our US House of Representatives has been fixed at a number of 435 seats. And so as populations shift, and as we know, populations are tending to move west and south, and so as a percentage of the US population, Pennsylvania is kind of getting lower and lower in that percentage. And you can see in this box that's showing up on your screen, the trend for our congressional seats has been going down. We don't have the data yet for 2020, but it's likely that might even go down to 17 from the current 18. So after the reapportionment, then comes redistricting. So the reapportionment happens at the federal level, but then each state draws its own boundaries. Pennsylvania has 2 redistricting procedures. One for congressional districts to send to DC, and that goes through a regular bill process through our state house. And the other one is state legislative districts, and that's a commission that's mandated by our state constitution. We're going to come back to both of these in a few minutes. In terms of the redistricting rules, it's grounded right in our state constitution that says districts shall be composed of compact and contiguous territory as nearly equal as in population as practicable. Also, no county or municipality shall be divided unless absolutely necessary in the redrawing. Those rules seem pretty simple and straightforward, don't they? Well, not so, thanks to gerrymandering. So let me tell you a little bit about gerrymandering, because you might say, well, what the heck is gerrymandering? Well, gerrymandering, quite simply, is the drawing of district boundaries to benefit a party or candidate. And it actually goes back to our founding fathers, where there was some gerrymandering going down where they were trying to kind of squeeze each other out. But it got its name, gerrymandering, in 1812, when Massachusetts Governor Gerry approved districts that favored his party. One of the local newspapers noticed that one of the districts, the way it was so squiggly around, kind of looked like a salamander. So they took Gerry, salamander, and now you have gerrymander. So that actually was used on a recent round of Jeopardy. And so keep that in your hats for any trivia contests that come down the pike. So that's where we get gerrymandering, and that's what gerrymandering is. So let's talk about hypothetically, what do we mean by gerrymander? Well, here's some different things that are happening. We want fair districts, which is the box on the left. So in this first one, those 4 large squares represent hypothetically 4 municipalities. And then each of the smaller squares represents a household. Now, ideally, as best as you can, you'd make districts that follow the municipal boundaries, and you wouldn't know anything about the households other than where they are. You'd have relatively even distribution, and you could see down on the bottom left, well, we don't know how many of those districts will go red and how many would go blue because we don't know anything about the voters. It's just around the municipalities. Well, then you start adding color. In the middle section, you see where we have the blues are in charge of districting. Now, all of a sudden, those nice straight lines start getting really funny and squiggly. And they did something, the blues did something called packing. They took all of the red voters and they made the boundaries squiggle around so they packed as many reds into one district as possible. Now, obviously, that district would tend to go red. But as a result, instead of not having to fight for the voters, 3 districts end up being blue. Well, that's if the blues control the process. Let's say the reds control the process with the very same configuration. If you see these red and blue households, and that's what those colors mean, is that they gather data so they can actually tell which way a household tends to vote. Back here, we want that information to be illegal to use. But here, they find out how households tend to vote. Big data can do that. Even your magazine subscriptions and things like that, they can predict your voting patterns. So here we are, the reds are in charge, and they do something called cracking. So they take this neighborhood of blue households here in the middle, and they crack it, splitting off a few into each district, and you end up with one district that ends up being blue and the other 3 red. So that's packing and cracking. And let's not forget, there's one more. It's called the sweetheart deal. That's a couple of people, guys usually these days, but it's not necessarily, shaking hands where, they say, well, our maps, hold on a second. Sorry about that, folks, advancing on me. So anyway, they can say, well, this is a bipartisan bill that got passed. Well, what happens is they talk to some folks from the other minority party, probably primarily the leaders, and say, hey, you know what, we'll make the line so that you're safe in your district, so you can vote for this, and it'll be quote unquote bipartisan, but really it's gerrymandered. Now, before I get into the next few slides, because in Pennsylvania, the gerrymandering that's been done over the last decade has been by the Republicans. But I want to make very clear, gerrymandering is an equal opportunity power grab that's relished by both major political parties. Now, for some of you that have a young person, child, grandchild, niece or nephew, whatever, and you want to have some fun with them, have them Google the phrase goofy kicking Donald Duck. That's goofy kicking Donald Duck. Here's Goofy, here's a kick, here's Donald Duck. Instead of going to a Disney website, they're going to go to the poster child of gerrymandering. And this map has been used all across the country. This is the old Pennsylvania 7th Congressional District, which winds its way through 5 counties in Pennsylvania. And by the way, Montgomery County gets cut up into 5 districts, all to create a Republican majority delegation. Well, right across the border in Maryland, the Democrats are in control of the state legislature in the last decennial. And they have this one, as you can see, kind of skips along with these tiny little isthmuses that connect it. Some people call that a pterodactyl with a broken wing. You could do whatever kind of Rorschach test you want to decide what you think it looks like. But what the Democrats were able to do in Maryland was basically eliminate one Republican congressperson from their state delegation to go to DC. So just to reiterate, both major political parties love to have power, and they'll both do it. I don't have this slide in here, but we've used a slide in the past, which is kind of we put up the quote first, talking about the horror of gerrymandering and how it's an attack on democracy. And then we come in the picture, and that was Ronald Reagan talking about what the Democrats did in California while he was governor. So the R's do it, the D's do it. If there's any gerrymandering, we want it for the voters. We want fair districts. So let's bring it home from the hypothetical to what's really happening in the Lehigh Valley. On this next few slides, remember the shapes that you're going to see. Here's what the Lehigh Valley Congressional District looked like in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s. I want you to notice that while it may kind of change a little bit at the fringes, each of those decades, it was all of Lehigh and all of Northampton County. And then because of the equal population clause, it had to pick up a little bit of some other county so that it was equal population to the other districts in the state. So look at this shape, and then let's take a look and see what happened in the last decade. So that was through the 70s to the 2000s. Let's look at 2012 to 2020. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead in time. Let's look at the maps for 2018 and 2020. Now, doesn't this look somewhat familiar? It's all Lehigh and Northampton County. And in this particular map drawing, we picked up a little bit of Monroe to keep equal population. Looks pretty familiar. Well, for the previous 3 cycles, we actually had this district. And you might say, like, what's going on here? Well, let's take a look at the next slide. Well, now color's been added to it, and you can see the voting pattern data. And this one is the one that, just notice here that in this upper corner, if you were to take who this district voted for in 2016, now this district did not exist in 2016, but we have the data and you can kind of see where this district would have been. The Lehigh Valley is known as a swing district. Northampton County gets a lot of national news because it tends to predict how Pennsylvania is going to go. And you see that it would have gone for Clinton by 1 point. 1 point's pretty close. So Lehigh Valley lives to its reputation of being a swing district. You know what? Some districts are going to be predominantly red. That's just what the communities are. Other districts might be predominantly blue. We want the districts to be what the community is, whatever that might be. So this is what happened in 2018 and 2020. What was the difference back in 2012, 14, and 16? Well, if you see what happened is instead of centering it on the Lehigh Valley, Easton over in this section, which tends to be blue, was linked actually up with a district that was like a horseshoe shape all the way around up into Hazleton, of all places. What does Easton have to do with all these counties and municipalities up here? And then it was stretched along the I-78 corridor almost to Harrisburg, which is blue, but not quite, and picked up enough red votes that when you look at who these folks voted for, and this was for real because that's the congressional district that existed in 2016, voted for Trump by 8 points. So you could see that this district was gerrymandered to be red. So how did this happen? Well, in 2011, Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the governorship. And what was the impact of that happening? Well, in the state, 54% of the vote went for Republican, 46% went Democrat. So you'd think it'd be roughly an even split because Pennsylvania is a swing state. No, 70% of the congressional delegation, or 13 out of 18 seats, were Republican, way out of line with how the party's votes went statewide. So how did we get to this situation on the right? Well, the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania and other good government groups sued, and the state, based on the state constitution, and the state Supreme Court ruled that the fair and equal election clause had been violated. They appointed a neutral special master, and let's see what the impacts of fair districts are. So again, remember I said Pennsylvania is a swing state. So there was the blue wave of 2018. So 55% of the state vote went Democrat, 45 went Republican. And with 18 seats at play, it was split 9-9. Now, I'm not too concerned about this 10-point spread that should have been a 10 or whatever. Depending on how the districts fall, this is way close enough with that smaller number. We'll see a very different situation in another slide or so. So what this says is that maps matter. We have to make sure our legislators are not drawing maps for their own political gains, and maps that represent communities. It makes a huge difference on who represents us and, quite frankly, on whether or not they'll talk to each other. So let's look a little bit at about how the state house cracks and packs in the Lehigh Valley affected us at the state house level. So the state legislative districts, again, is that state constitution mandated commission. It's 4 legislative leaders plus a chair that they elect. And if they can't agree, it gets to the Supreme Court. So their maps were drawn behind closed doors. It was reviewed and approved by the public? No. The legislator, the full legislator? No. The governor's office? No. Well, let's see what happened. What did that mean? Here locally, Salisbury and South Whitehall were split into 3 congressional districts. Notice that 2 of them went Republican and Whitehall was split into 2. So you can see, for example, South Whitehall, where I live, these neighborhoods that tended to vote blue, and again, this is data that should not be allowed to be used, but it is, they were packed in with an already blue district in Western Allentown. Whitehall and Salisbury, those blue areas of those townships were packed into an already blue 133rd district. Let's look at what the impact of that gerrymandering had. Statewide, the vote, again, this is that 2018 vote where we had the blue wave, went 55% Democrat. So you would think with 203 votes, that's a much larger sample. You'd be much closer to seeing that majority of democratically held seats. No, the Republicans got 55% of the votes because of these kinds of gerrymanders where they packed and cracked to create districts that the Republicans could win. Now, just remember, I'm getting on the Republicans right now. That's because they're the ones who did it in this round. We don't necessarily think the Democrats would act, we would hope, but don't necessarily expect the Democrats would act any differently. So that's how gerrymandering happens. That's what it's about. That's how it's getting done. What do we see as the impacts? Major parties focus on control, not governance. Incumbents, especially the leadership, are protected. They have a 95% re-election rate. Rank and file members are beholden to the party leaders, not to their constituents, because if you don't listen to what I tell you to do, the next time we draw boundaries, oops, you've been written out of your own district, and now you have to run against someone else who's been the representative for years and is well known. Elections increasingly get decided in the primaries. You've heard the verb now, it's a new verb that's come up in the last 10 years, getting primaried, because if you're not holding the dogma enough or not, extreme to the too much, can't go, if you don't go far enough to the left or to the right to satisfy the base in either party, you'll get primaried. And then that's where the decisions get made. So independents, of which there's a significant percentage in Pennsylvania, all the decisions get made in the primary because it's a gerrymandered district and it's predetermined that that person will win. That resulting polarization and gridlock from all of this poll, just a brief story. If anyone remembers Congressman Boehner, who was the House Speaker for back in the early 2010s, he had a heck of a time with the Tea Party Congress people that came in with the Tea Party wave. And part of that was the Republicans had done a very good job in the 2010 cycle to gerrymander districts so that those were in safe districts, and then those representatives really catered to the extreme, in this case, extreme right of their Republican Party. And instead of having that, kind of compromising, working together environment, they just went full hog and they didn't even need to listen to Boehner because they weren't safe at districts. And if they wanted to get reelected, they had to go extreme. But don't just take my word for it. There are studies by Harvard and the Pennsylvania Economy League. In 2016, Harvard Business School did a study, and amongst a number of factors that they found decreased American competitiveness globally was gerrymandering. So they identified it as for private business that gerrymandering was a bad thing. The Pennsylvania Economy League released a report in 2014, and in part of that report, they reflected back to a report they put out in 2004, which said that there were about 6,000 state regulations, many of which were out of date and hindered local municipal boards and county commissions from updating their techniques and regulations to promote business and encourage efficient business. 3,000 of those 6,000 are mandated. They called for the state to please undertake it to revise those and update and eliminate as needed. 10 years later, 2014, little was done on that. So gerrymandering equals inaction and dysfunction. In the last 10 years, less than 10% of the proposed bills were enacted. So a legislator that you know will say, sure, I'll submit that as a bill, but the chances of that getting any daylight, unlikely. So the inactions, critical issues not dealt with: tax reform, school funding, pension obligations, infrastructure, lead levels in children, from our case, redistricting reform. Go ahead and think about what's an issue you care a lot about. Has anything happened with it? This is why nothing's happened. In addition to inaction, there's dysfunction. You know, bad policy gets pushed through, and there was a hijacking that's being attempted right now to gerrymander judicial district, to create districts at the state level so that you can the legislative leaders can then gerrymander them. So let me talk a little bit about judicial gerrymandering. Let's back up and just take a look at what our Pennsylvania judicial system looks like. It's got this growing pyramid where you have the magisterial courts and Philly and Philadelphia courts. Those justices are elected very locally. Then the courts of common appeals take actions from those in some larger cases. Those are also elected by voters in regional districts, but they are focusing mostly on regional issues. The top three levels, the Superior, Commonwealth, and Supreme Courts, those are called our high courts or appellate courts or courts of appeal. Those 31 judges make decisions that affect the entire state. And currently, all of us get to vote for all 31 of those justices because their decisions affect all of us. The Superior Court handles most civil and criminal cases. Commonwealth Court focuses mostly on cases involving public agencies, and the Supreme Court is the final arbiter for state judicial actions. So all 31 of those judges make decisions that affect the entire state, and every one of us gets to vote for all 31 of them. So, you know, what would this we call it the judicial gerrymandering bill do? There's actually two bills because you have to pass them in two concurrent sessions. HB 196 went through like lightning last session. HB 38 is what's hanging in this session, and they want to try to get it passed so they can implement this with a constitutional amendment. It calls for a constitutional amendment that organizes the judiciary into representative districts. Why? One of the reasons given by the prime sponsor, Representative Diamond, is that there are different philosophies on how to apply the law based on how and where you grew up. Really? We do not agree with that assessment that that's the way judges believe. You know, there's a lot of learning, and we would expect judges to have a much broader view. But let's take him at his word and look at that. He talks about, Representative Diamond talks about 50% of the current appellate court judges come from or live in Allegheny or Philadelphia areas. Well, we took a look at, again, taking from his word and said, where do they come from? And you could see the two pie charts on the right show that, in fact, where appellate judges grew up or came from or had lived in pretty much mirrors, you know, what the courts are looking like. So the population in those two counties, Allegheny and Philadelphia, is around 22%, and is about 30% of the judges that are from that area, you know, from those areas. But you could see the vast majority come from other places. So his reasoning doesn't make sense. Now, I will mention that the Republican legislature was very angry with some of the decisions the Democrat-leaning Supreme Court has made in the last few years. And I wonder if that might be a motivation for trying to push this. The judicial districts bill is radical. Right now, we have co-equal branches of government. Legislative branch creates, the executive branch enforces, the judicial branch interprets. They are co-equal. If this judicial gerrymandering bill gets passed, the legislature would be the one drawing the lines. And just imagine with all those squiggly lines that you saw, how they were able to gerrymander and lean it, towards the Republican candidates, what they would be able to do with the judiciary. Also, if you think about it, right now, those judges, when they come up for election or for retention, they have to appeal to the entire state. Yet, if they are districts, their decisions affect the whole state. But if they want to get reelected or retained in the judicial elections, they may start thinking about whether this decision affects how it might affect their constituents in their district. Judges should not be thinking of cases before them in terms of constituents, but only in terms of litigants and what the law says. So concentrating this power within the legislative branch would destroy our system of checks and balances. It's a very dangerous bill. The problem is that because it got pushed through so quickly, voters tend to not read very much up or study or research constitutional amendments. They assume due diligence has been done by the legislature, but in this case, the due diligence has not been done. Let me show you how. So, is the judicial districts bill a good idea? Bar associations and good government groups agree it is a very, very bad idea. It's been tabled for now, but stay alert. They could resurrect it at any moment and try to get it onto the fall ballot. So we have to keep our eyes open. There's a lot going on in this area, and that's what Fair District is trying to keep up on, and that's why we appreciate so much you're taking the time to be with us. Let's take for a moment, we've talked about congressional gerrymandering, state legislature gerrymandering, and judicial gerrymandering. Let's take a moment to talk about prison gerrymandering. As I mentioned, I just learned about this recently. Current Pennsylvania election code specifically prohibits this, yet back on the 2000 redistricting, 8 Pennsylvania House districts met the minimum federal population requirement only because they counted prisoners, and that's not down here at the state level, that's what the census does, counts prisoners where they habitate. And so that's where their prison is, not where they're from. Now, some states have laws passed that specifically say, all right, we understand that the census initially reports it that way, but we want the information where these inmates are from, and that's where they should be counted for the purposes of redistricting. So what does this do? This shifts seats to prison counties, but yet the inmates cannot vote, so they're counted in a county they can't vote on. The representatives and the local population aren't going to look after their needs. So it's just a win-win for these prison-based locales, but a lose-lose for the areas of where those inmates came from. And I want to mention that this hurts both urban and rural. Yes, it's true that many of those inmates might come from the urban areas, but there are also rural counties that when you do the analysis, they would have more bodies counted and therefore more representation if inmates were counted where they're from, not where they are residing in a prison. So Fair Districts PA, for that reason, supports HB 704 and SB 104, which, even though it's already prohibited, really strengthens and expands on the guidelines about how to count prisoners and where to count them. But again, because of gerrymandering and rules conflicts, no hearings were made on these bills in last session. If you want to learn more, and this will be on a handout that I'll mention in a minute, but prisonersofthecensus.org/Pennsylvania will give you an update on what's going on in this area. So who are they representing? Let's take a look at two of the issues that I just talked about, the legislative gerrymandering and the, what they hope for is this judicial gerrymandering. So who are they representing? Part one. For the last 4 years, fair districts redistricting bills had broad public support, more co-sponsors than any other bill, half of the House. The Independent Citizens Commission was supported by 24 county commissions and 389 municipalities, representing 70% of Pennsylvanians. Over 100,000 petition signatures, 400 support letters across the state, and 2/3 of Pennsylvania citizens responding to a poll in 2019 supported the idea of redistricting reform. A lot of support within the legislature and across the state. And what did that mean? Nothing. No floor vote was given into the House. In fact, they kind of corrupted the original bill to something that we wouldn't want to pass. And then in the Senate, they added a poison pill to assure that even Democrats would want to vote against it, because they actually added this judicial gerrymandering as an amendment to that bill, to the Fair Districts bill, which is totally anti what we believe. So who are they representing? Doesn't seem like us. Well, then who are they representing? Let's say part two. With these judicial gerrymandering bills, this would allow party leaders to create, AKA gerrymander, judicial districts. The bills pass in the House and the Senate with less than 1 hour public debate, no expert testimony or public input, no cross-partisan support, opposed by over 100 Pennsylvania groups. So let's take a quick review. Redistricting reform, both congressional and state legislative, blocked for 40 years. Wait a second, make that 30 years. The League of Women Voters PA first testified in front of at Harrisburg 30 years ago about redistricting reform. This is not something that's new with the hyper-partisanship that's been happening the last few years. This goes back decades. Judicial gerrymandering pushed through in 18 months. So while they block good reforms for 30 years, they push through bad reforms or bad actions in 18 months. Merit selection, the league has been advocating for that or something other than elections for justices for 70 years. And the prison gerrymandering, which got no hearings last session. So that's kind of where we're at. But you know what? It's not about the problems. Let's step just that, but let's see why. What's the source of the problem? Why are the scales so out of balance? The answer is simple. Rules allow party leaders to block good bills and fast-track bills. So instead of the public weighing in about what they want, party leaders have all the say. 4 positions control that process. So remember I said the rank and file really don't have any control. They just do what they're told by the speaker, the Senate pro tem, the majority leaders, and the committee chairs. League of Women Voters and Fair Districts PA, which is citizen-led and nonpartisan. Sometimes I like to say we're a good government project, because once you say nonpartisan, they're thinking, oh, it's a partisan. We're a good government group. We're trying to push down on that scale and bring the public will back into action here. So let's look at how gerrymandering and rules work together to end reform, to make a dead end for reforms. So the leaders draw the districts, and they can because they control the process. Those distorted districts protect the incumbents, especially the leaders. Then the majority leaders make the rules. HR 1 is the House resolution. That's the quote unquote first resolution that gets passed. And that has all the rules, how things move into committee, out of committee, cross committees, how votes are taken. It's all the rules for each, and the beginning of each session. That's the first business that they have to take care of is HR 1. Well, that's interesting, HR 1. But yet, wait, on day 1, the rank and file members are asked to vote not on HR 1, but on HR 2. See the blindfolds on those folks? They're just given HR 2. And what does HR 2 say? It's a very short House resolution. It says, there shall be no amendments to HR 1. So before we even get to HR 1, they pass a resolution that says, hey, we're going to put in a resolution, but you're not even allowed to think about any amendments. Then after HR 2 passes, they bring in HR 1. That has all the rules, that keeps everything the same. So the rules prevent reform, and then we're back to the leaders drawing the districts, and the cycle continues. It does not have to be this way. If we can change the rules, we can get the hyper-partisan thumbs off the scale. So whether it's trying to get a voting committee or trying to get once a bill got out of committee onto the floor, or once a bill got passed in one house, one chamber, and wants to move to the other, if there's strong bipartisan support, they should get a vote in committee. They should get a vote on the floor. They should get a vote in the other chamber. These are things that make sense to us. We have to get those thumbs off the scale. Now, I will say that there's so much going on, particularly with LACRA, which I'm going to get into in a minute, that we're working on that hard right now. As important as this is, and we did have a lot of initiatives, legislators who do want to reform the process and put a lot of resolutions in to change the rules. Right now, we're not supporting any specific resolutions. We'll be working on that, I'm sure, but right now we're focusing on trying to make sure that the redistricting that gets done after the census, it gets done properly. So remember a while back, I mentioned about the state legislative districts by state constitution gets done by the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. Well, they've recently, this is all new stuff that I have in the rest of my slides here. This has just recently been appointed. So as I mentioned, the majority, minority leaders of the Senate and the House, those are the four constitutionally mandated members. They elect the chair. They're chosen by that chair is chosen by a vote of those four. If they cannot agree or they deadlock, then the Supreme Court, which is currently 5 Dems and 2 Republicans, they get to pick the chair. Now, remember, we don't want the Dems to control the process or the Republicans. That chair in the past has tended to be a partisan, and then it just basically is 3 people drawing the districts for the whole state. We have seen some encouraging signs. It's the first time that there are women on LRC. It's the first time there's a person of color on the LRC. And March 26th, this is hot off the presses, there's actually a press release calling for applications for the chair position. So if you are really into this process or you know someone that's really into it, they can go to this website and actually find out more about the position and apply for the chair position. So that all sounds good, but we need to stay alert. No matter how many public pronouncements and public statements and press releases come out, we need to stay on top of it and make sure that each step of the way, the process could get corrupted, and we're going to have to stay alert and on top of this. So last session, those 4 years of fighting that we did, that door closed. Getting our constitutional amendment for an independent citizens commission, which is what we wanted, that door closed. But what I love about our state team, they opened up another door. And so right now in this session, which just started in January, legislative session started in January, the Legislative and Congressional Redistricting Act, LACRA, House Bill 22 and Senate Bill 222 were submitted. The legislators are going to remain having a role. We wanted a citizens commission, but that's out the door, at least until we can do a constitutional amendment. But LACRA would at least have clear prohibitions, require transparency, mandate public engagement, and contain map drawing criteria. So we think these are good next steps and still worth fighting for. Let's look just briefly at some of what LACRA has in it. Transparency. It would require multiple public hearings. They would also mandate that they follow open meeting rules. You'd think that would be something that would be obvious, but they've been doing it behind closed doors for decades. This would mandate open meeting rules. And it would be live streamed. Public engagement, a user-friendly website for maps, to view the maps and for public comments on them. But even better, it would mandate that Pennsylvania residents can submit maps. I want to stop here for a second and mention drawthelinespa.org. Look at that website and jot it down, drawthelinespa.org. If you're a teacher or you know a teacher, this is a great website that has, or just for yourself, if you want to learn about gerrymandering. I mean, we've got a lot of information on the Fair Districts website. This is another one that's excellent. But even better, what they have is they've been running a competition for the last couple of years. They've had a K to 12 division, a collegiate division, and an adult division, where they've selected, people are actually drawing maps, and then a committee selects what they think are the best maps. So the technology has evolved where it used to be controlled just by the map drawers in the back room, but now it's evolved so that we citizens can stay on top of it. So if they put out any maps that look squirrely, and by the way, I want to mention, just because a map doesn't have all those goofy kicking Donald Duck weird lines on it, it could look relatively normal, but it could still be gerrymandered. So you have to really test it. And I think Draw the Lines is going to give us the tools to do that. So moving on, in terms of prohibitions, protecting incumbents and discriminating against political parties will be explicitly prohibited. And then for drawing the maps, it will strengthen that compact and contiguous rule and give some clear guidance for how counties and municipalities should be split, or better, even better, not split. So that's LACRA in a nutshell. Now let's get to the to how you can help. And just by the way, these last three slides I'm going to go through, in the chat room is a PDF that you can download so that you can see all of these websites and all of these ideas for helping. I want to start off by saying this is an issue that finally can be discussed and agreed on with families and friends. You could learn more by going to our website. You can attend the monthly Lehigh Valley Fair Districts meeting. Next one's coming up this next Monday. Go to the website, click on events, scroll down to the April 5th Lehigh Valley Zoom meeting, and click on the RSVP link to get the link. There's a day of action, Thursday, April 29th. We're going to go to Bethlehem and go to the Liberty Bell Museum and Arts Quest to have a day where we can all get together in a socially distanced kind of way. So sign up for Fair Districts PA and find out about that stuff. Schedule a speaker, any size group, any length. I've done talks as short as 6 minutes when I've had to in front of municipal board. We'll accommodate you any way we can. And join us on Fair Facebook. You also can write letters to the editor. There's tips and help in fairdistrictspa.com. You don't have to do it yourself. Support LACRA, support the end of prison gerrymandering. Tell the LRC you support the open chair search and transparency. We're not running on this right now, but stay tuned. We might need your help with letters about calls for rules reform and opposing judicial districts. You also can meet online with your lawmakers. You don't need to do this alone. It's the same issues as I listed for the letters to the editor. Here's a call specifically, if you're so moved, there's some LACRA visits that are already planned for April 9th and April 13th. So if you're in Representative McKenzie's district 134 or Representative Mako's district 183, and would be willing to come, any constituent, but particularly if you're a Republican, would be excellent to have on that group. And again, you're not doing it alone. There's planning meetings. This again is also going to be in the handout that you'll see in the chat that you see in the chat room, where you can get on the planning meeting tomorrow night if you're available and are interested, or if you're just curious and want to hear and listen and then decide. So those are ways that you can help with our lawmakers. We need to keep the pressure on them. Again, tips and helpers available at the website. So in conclusion, a lot of information that I gave to you on the slides. There's information in the chat box in that PDF. There's information on the websites that are also in that PDF. And I hope that you'll leave this talk with the idea that, as I said at the beginning, gerrymandering may not be the issue you care about most. It's just the issue you need to care about first. So at this time, I'll sign off and turn off slide share. And we'll see what's came in on the chat room with any questions and other comments.
Whew, thank you, Jerry. There was a lot that added some clarity to what for me seemed really a complicated issue. But Alan, anything in the chat, Alan, that you wanted to?
Well, there was one question in the chat Terry, along the way, you'd mentioned a study relating gerrymandering to reduced American competitiveness.
Yes, the
And,
Harvard Business School study. Yeah.
and so Lucy had asked, could you expound on that further?
I'd have to go back to it. I used to talk about that in more detail, but they surveyed, suffice it to say, what I can say right now is that they surveyed business leaders and asked them what was affecting their ability to be competitive globally. And there were a number of issues listed, but one of the ones that ranked high was the polarization and gridlock and the fact that gerrymandering impacted those. If you'd like, I can get a link to the study and send that to you.
Maybe, but I guess also what I meant was, what do you mean by competitiveness? And also, I don't really care if America's the best, just so long as I care. What I think would be ideal is good jobs, healthcare, awesome art, and a sustainable, environmentally cared for planet for people in all countries. Though I thought it might have meant more than just American first, so I wanted to get into a bit of competitive how.
I see what you're saying. I don't have the details of that, but in terms of what I've seen from other studies, extrapolating what I've seen from other studies, is here in the United States, when you have communities that have good quality of life and environmental protection issues, those tend to be attractive to corporations. So I don't think it's too much of an extrapolation to say that if that's done more on a national scale, that same thing would be true. But I don't want to speak beyond what I've seen on that study.
Alan, anything else?
Yeah, not in the chat, and we have such a small number of people. I think it's absolutely fine if people can want to raise their electronic hand or simply raise their human hand. Joy, you have your electronic hand up.
You need to unmute,
And
Joy.
How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I really like the explanation. It was very well explained simply. Now the issue is, how do we get the minority populations in the whole state involved? A lot of this is very clear in English, but how do we present this to other speakers of other languages, other cultures, to understand even just the technology of getting onto this event and mute, unmute video. Do you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So I wish somehow we need to address those issues more and more, because I don't want to see the hate and the violence keep on rising in so many things, because people don't know people well enough and they just assume. So I'm hoping that inclusion should include all types of groups to learn about this gerrymandering in a simple way, but also a lot of us older folks don't know how to do the computer and so forth. So we've got to really work hard to do presentations somehow, even with the virus and the distancing and everything else. There's a lot to be considered. And I just,
Thanks, Joy.
I'll try to speak that up.
Yeah, let's see if Terry has any kind of comment on that.
Thank you for letting me ask.
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Joy, and hello and happy Passover. So a few things. We have a Slack account for volunteers, and Slack, for those of you that may not be familiar with it, is one of these social media kind of team productivity applications. So you can join different kind of teams within Slack, within Fair Districts, so that we have a speakers bureau, we have a mapping bureau, we have a resolutions bureau that, help coordinate getting all those resolutions. And I just noticed in the last week or so, someone had posted that if I remember correctly, don't quote me on this, I think they had produced the version of our talks in Spanish, and they were reaching out to see if anybody knew any fluent Spanish speakers who could start delivering the slideshows. So that's one thing. We periodically reach out to other social justice groups and are happy to partner with anybody who's willing to work with us. And if you go to our website, you can see the groups that have signed on as partner organizations to fair districts. I haven't looked at it recently, so I don't know who's on it right now. And then in terms of the technology question, it definitely is a barrier. I mean, for folks, I'm working with someone who's currently a resident of one of the senior communities over in the Bethlehem area, I think. And he's working with his facilities director, programs director, to reach out to other programs directors to see if we can get some set up with other senior communities around the Lehigh Valley. So we're trying different ways, and that's why I encourage anyone who wants to invite us to their group, either civic organization or congregational organization. We'll work with you to do whatever you want, and hopefully we won't need to keep doing this for years, but at some point we'll be able to do these live again. So that's it.
I have a question. You may have covered this, Terry, so I apologize in advance if I missed it, but I thought, is there any possibility of anything being on either the primary ballot, like a referendum or a question, or perhaps in the fall on the ballot?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It's certainly worth reiterating it. That judicial gerrymandering constitutional amendment passed through last session, which ended in December. And just let me back up a second. To amend our state constitution, the process is you have a bill that gets passed by both chambers in a session. It's a 2-year session. The last one ended in December of 2020. The same exact bill with no changes in wording, it's not allowed to have any changes, has to pass in the next legislative session. So they did it really quickly in just a few months last year. And then within a matter of days, they passed it with no hearings in January of this year. And I'm not really sure why, but as you may recall, I mentioned that over 100 groups in Pennsylvania came out against those bills, those proposed constitutional amendments. And so that got tabled. And there's a requirement that you have to have, I think it's 90 days, it's either 3 months or 90 days before the date of the election, that it has to get advertised. And that might be fresh in people's memory because of the screw up by the Department of State when they didn't get the advertisement out at the required time for the child abuse window. That was going to be a change to the amendment, and that cost somebody their job, as it should have. That was a horrible mistake. But anyway, so for whatever reason, whether it was political pressure or some other reason or strategy, they voted it out of committee, but it was tabled in so that it passed the deadline, Marianne, of when it could be to allow it to be brought into the primary election. However, there are some constitutional amendments which I'm not going to speak to because it's not on fair districts, but be aware that there's some very important constitutional amendments that are put on with the same lack of oversight, got put on the primary. Please don't just assume that you should be voting. You should take a close look at them. I'm not going to say anything more because it's not a fair districts issue, but please take a look at those amendments and tell your friends to really think about how they want to vote on those. But however, where I said it's tabled, but we have to stay alert, is these judicial gerrymandering bills, they could bring them up in a moment's notice because of the rules. They could bring them up in a flash of an eye, literally, and vote them so that they could appear on the November ballot. So we have to stay alert. It's on the back burner for right now, but we've got to stay alert. That's where there's so much shenanigans going on in Harrisburg. It's like whack-a-mole in terms of trying to keep an eye on them. But it's a good question. The things are okay right now, but we have to stay alert. And by joining both on our website and our Facebook page, you'll get notifications of when you need to be, helping us, out with stuff. So good question. Next, please.
Terry, Tamara made a comment in the chat about a really good experience of making a pro-LACRA visit to the legislature today, and commented that you get a lot of insight on what's happening within the legislature, within committees, and so forth. And of course, you make your voice heard, and the legislators know that people care. Maybe a question derived from that. You commented about the generally partisan or hyper-partisan nature of the people who end up in leadership, and you told the story of process manipulation with HR1 and HR2. Can you comment beyond those maneuverings of leadership, what the sense is of rank and file legislators, as it were?
So let me reflect back on that, Alan. Let me reflect back on what happened with HB 22, which was the constitutional amendment last session. We had at one point about, I think it was about 99 or 100 co-sponsors. And, with that, you had, no other bill had that many. So it was clearly bipartisan support for that bill. Most of them were Democrats, but that's just the way the parties run. But we had a significant number, I think a couple of dozen Republicans. And the leaders just don't even have to pay attention. They honestly, there's nothing that they have to do. We had a horrible experience with someone who was the chair of the House Committee on State Government Committee for the House, who was the one who announced at 5 p.m., just to kind of get a sense of how corrupt these are, 5 p.m. on one day, announces there's going to be a committee meeting the next morning. Okay, with no agenda, no one knows what it is. They show up at 9 o'clock the next morning. What he did was he took our constitutional amendment and inverted it, and actually rewrote it and made it so that the legislators would have even more gerrymandering power, and just basically forced a vote right there on the spot. No discussion. The Democrats tried to just get them to at least just delay the vote just so they can have some discussion. And they voted on it, like, I don't know, within a half an hour, an hour. So the leaders are, feeling totally empowered by that. Now, we are hearing from the current leadership, Terzai retired. There were some other retirements. So there is some change in the leadership in the House and the Senate. We are hearing some good things, and that's why I said that there were some encouraging signs, particularly with that press release. If you go to the website and read the full press release, there's a statement from each member of the commission, the LRC, to talk about what they are hoping for an open process. So we're hopeful, but at the same time, we are not going to take anything for granted. Did that answer your question? If not, rephrase it and I'll try again.
Yeah, it does. It does. It maybe begs a question of I think it interesting combining with what you said about the maneuverings around HR1 and HR2.
Yep.
Because there's a process under which leadership can do that, and the rank and file didn't have
no control. Zero.
About it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Who else has a question? Barry.
Marty had one in the.
I'm sorry.
Marty in the chat, but go ahead, Barry, and then. Oh.
You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Gerrymandering has been going on for a long, long time. We learned about it in political science in college, and the Jerry and gerrymander, who it's named after, I think was in the 1800s.
1812, yep, that's right, Governor Gerry.
So it's part of life in the United States. And my question is, given that it just keeps going on and it's there, and somehow we still survive, how do we make the case that this is something really dangerous and it's eating away at the roots of democracy? How do we make that, just in a very simple essence of the case, make that come alive, that this is a danger to us all?
Well, that's what we try to do by giving these talks. I don't have a magic bullet. I wish I had a love potion that we could put in the municipal water and get everybody on board. But it's just events like this and people talking to each other. And like I said, I like to say on my talks back in the day, this is probably the one conversation about politics that you can have over the Thanksgiving table, because it really is really good. And there was a lot in my talk today. When I first started giving these talks, we were just talking about legislative gerrymandering. We weren't talking about prison gerrymandering. We weren't talking about judicial gerrymandering. So I was able to expand on it. And so, we would be able to actually have, some more examples, but that just shows you just how much is going on with everything that's happening. And also, to one of the earlier questions, I actually had a couple of slides where we go into some more detail on that Harvard study and the Pennsylvania Economy League study, where it would actually go into how dangerous it is. The only thing I'll end with trying to answer your question, Barry, is to say that one of the things we would say in those early talks was the United States is the only major democracy that allows legislators to draw their own districts. The only major democracy that allows legislators to pick their voters as opposed to voters picking their legislators.
Thank you.
So Terry, oh, I'm sorry, did somebody else? No, okay. Marty had a question in the chat about rules. If we could all agree that our districts could be fair, if our legislators would accede to the notion that our districts should be fairly drawn. Could you talk about some of the ideas that are out there in terms of what the rules would be by which the boundaries are drawn?
That's an interesting question. Let me answer it this way. We've had people say to us, well, let's just let the computer do it and let's get the humans out of it. Well, for any of us that know programming, it's the programmer that makes the decisions, that governs what the computer algorithm is going to say. So one is that transparency. So it's really as much about process rather than the specifics. So one is transparency, having people out there. Two is the prohibition against use of political data. So right now, it is absolutely legal for them to go and find out, what your household's political persuasion is. And they do that by big data. Like I said, the magazine subscriptions, voter records are public records. They can pull all that in. And so prohibition against using political data, stronger guidelines on some of you may know the name Amanda Holt. She was a county commissioner until recently, and her claim to fame, to her credit, was she on her own as a school teacher before computers could do everything it could do now. Back in 2010, 2011, her case went to the state Supreme Court, showing how she at home was able to draw better maps, fairer maps, more fair maps than the state leaders did. Just by and she one of the reasons why she won her court case was because she showed that she could cut in half the number of counties and municipalities that were split, which is in the state constitution, which they regularly ignore. So transparency, clear rules, and also, quite frankly, just following laws. Can you imagine if one of us violated the state constitution? You know, we'd be brought up on charges, but they've been doing it for decades. It's in the state constitution. So it's kind of a combination of having the rules, but also having the accountability. So it's kind of a chicken and egg that we're dealing with, Marty, is this chicken and egg of, you know, it's the rules that keep them in power. So they have these safe districts. So it makes it hard for us to do. And that's why we really have to try to break through to any of our, particularly any of our Republican friends and family in the red sections of the state. We have fair districts or chapters all across the state. But like I said, honestly, if you have any family or friends in the other parts of Pennsylvania, particularly if they happen to be registered Republican, you can start talking to them, and can do one of the good things about Zoom is that we can reach out to anybody and ask them to work with us. So hopefully that gave you a couple of little tidbits of that. Other questions?
Lucy has a question.
Go ahead, please. You're on mute, Lucy.
You know, I'd really just like for this moment to say good evening.
I do want to say thank you. I was thinking of kind of wrapping things up, but Terry has offered to hang around, and I don't know if you still feel that way, Terry, if there are any final questions. Okay, if so, please feel if you want to leave the meeting, that is certainly okay. We thank you for coming. I actually did have a couple. Oh, and the other thing before you leave, you will be getting an email tomorrow that will have the information sheet that was in the chat that gives you things that actions you can take, things you can do, as well as I'll send out the Terry's slides from tonight. And so what I really was wondering, are there any states that get it right? I mean, is there a state that is?
Yep. Firstly, just I'll answer that question in a second, Marianne. Before people start signing off,
Okay.
just again, an encouragement. I was asked to make sure that anybody who's in Mako's or Mackenzie's district, you know, or if you know somebody and they just want some more information before they commit, it's really, as anxiety producing as it might seem, it's really kind of low pressure because we go in there with a group of people. We don't try to gang up on them because we're trying to convince them. So we try to be really polite when we go in there. So if you're new to the process and just are willing to be a body, to be a constituent, or you know somebody in one of those districts, you know, please, you know, reach out to us. And if it's a little bit too quick turnaround, that's fine. Just join fair districts. You know, get a hand on all that stuff. So, Marianne, your question again?
Well, but now getting to what you just said, that is sometimes what keeps me from attending those things, because I don't really grasp it all, you know, all the time. And feeling like, and I know Jan, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but you've actually attended, and you actually made me feel a little bit about, you don't really have to speak up, and having extra bodies who are just there to say, hey, I care about this and I want to learn, and that's okay too.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Jan, you first.
Oh, I'd be happy to speak to it. I was actually part of a group. We had a leader. There were 4 of us, and we all met with Representative Mackenzie. She was clueless. She hadn't read the bill, and we asked her directly if she would co-sponsor it, and she wouldn't answer directly. She basically said no. So I guess that was direct. Anyway, it was not a terrifying experience. It was actually really
empowering.
It was very empowering, and I recommend folks do it. You learn a lot.
Yeah.
Good.
But by the way, the meeting coming up with Mackenzie is a different Mackenzie.
It's her son.
It's her son, Brian
Yeah,
Mackenzie.
Okay.
I should have made that distinction that there's 2 of them now. So thank you, Jan, for bringing that up. And I did hear about that meeting, and as sad as it might seem, we find that more often than not, one of 2 things is going on. Either the legislator honestly doesn't know Because there's there's thousands of bills that are submitted. And until we as constituents say, hey, you need, unless somebody in their leadership told them that they better understand about this, or we finally get through and say, you need to read this and understand it. Oftentimes they don't really know about what's in the bill, or they claim ignorance because it allows them to then not take a stand. We don't know which it is, but it's either perceived or real, lack of knowledge. Marianne, I think there was a question there. I'm not sure if I answered it.
Well, I just was curious if there is a state that gets it right.
Oh, yes.
Does a
There
better
are a
job.
lot of states that get it. One of the slides, I'm trying to keep this talk down as much as I could. There is a great slide that we have. There's a project out there called the Fairness Project. I might have the name wrong, but you could see it. I think we have it on our website. I'm not sure where, but Colorado was an example. So there are projects all over, looking at democracy and how well or poorly we're doing. And the Fairness Project looks at how fair the agendas are that are set by different state legislatures. Pennsylvania gets a horrible grade. We have the most expensive, the largest full-time legislature in the country with one of the lowest productivity rates. Colorado considered redistricting reform, and I think it was something ridiculous. Within a matter of 30 or 40 days, they updated their redistricting rules and got it done. We've been fighting for decades here. The other is in California, which I mentioned about how horribly it was gerrymandered back in Reagan's days as governor. Back in the late 1990s, one of the things that California has that Pennsylvania does not is called the public referendum. So the only way we can get things onto the constitutional amendments is through the legislature. The only way we can get statewide action is through the legislature. In states like California, they have referenda. I lived in California for several years, and you would get a book. It was foreboding back. I'm sure now they do it all electronically. It was like, whole forests where they would have the official language, the plain language language, the pros and cons, and you'd be able to see each referendum they had. And that's how gerrymandering got through, because Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats fought tooth and nail, but they were able to get it through the public referendum. And as a consequence, after they got it passed, several state legislators bowed out. They didn't even rerun because they knew that they were done for. There was no way that they'd be able to stand up to the scrutiny because they were so corrupt or, deadwood, literally. And then after about 2 or 3 cycles, the public opinion of the state legislature went from like single digits to, I can't remember what it was, but very high. So there are examples of states who have been able to make these changes. In 2018, I think it was, there were a few states, I want to say Michigan, I'm not sure, but there were a few states that none of them are perfect. And one, in case you ever talk to any good government groups that say, oh, those fair districts PA bills got this mistake and that mistake. Absolutely, I'll agree with them. No bill is going to be perfect, but what we would get is eons better than what we have now. So there are states that are getting it right. So there is hope out there, but it's a tough road to hoe because of the way the rules are.
Well, thanks, Terry. This was really mind-blowing in a way. That might be a funny word, but that's how I'm feeling right now. But I will look at that sheet of things to do, and I hope the rest of you will too. And I really thank you for all the time and energy. And unless there are other comments or questions, I just want to say thank you and good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.